So you've heard the news. Kubernetes deprecates Docker at version 1.20. Well, at least that's what majority of people got from that. And it caused sheer panic, because apparently people tend to form very strong opinions on the subject before studying it, or at least reading more than a first line on the newsfeed post. It wouldn't have caused any misunderstandings or controversy if the press were not so desperate for clicks. But what can you do? Journalism. What was written in this changelog in reality is the following. Docker support in the kubelet is now deprecated and will be removed in a future release. They even explain it further. The kubelet uses a module called Docker shim, which implements CRI support for Docker, and it has seen maintenance issues in the Kubernetes community. Yeah, Docker does not have container runtime interface out of the box. We encourage you to evaluate moving to a container runtime that is a full-fledged implementation of CRI, v1 Alpha 1 or v1 compliant, as they become available. And what that actually means, that Docker shim is no longer required to run Kubernetes. If that doesn't clarify everything for you, then let's figure out what exactly is this Kubernetes Docker container runtime stuff. As you may know, Kubernetes is a bunch of machines that run kubelet as a service. It is a local service that basically keeps the node in a cluster. So everything related to Kubernetes is ran as a container on this host and started and stopped and maintained by kubelet. So kubelet talks to a container runtime. And for the longest time it was Docker. So it asks Docker to start or stop a certain container. But what is Docker? Well, now it's many things. Now, Docker started as a monolith. Before version 1.11, everything happened within the same process. But with version 1.11, Docker Inc. decided to split the thing into multiple pieces for maintainability. So now the word Docker describes only the top level of this ecosystem. The word Docker that you type in a terminal is a CLI tool that talks to a Docker daemon, usually run on a Unix socket on var run docker sock. Dockerd is a Docker daemon. Its only job by now is to translate this command that you've typed, the Docker command, into a container runtime. And that's where the Docker ends. See, we're not even close to a container, and the rest is not Docker anymore. No, mind you, everything is supported, maintained and developed by Docker Inc., but it's other projects. Then containerd comes in. That's the actual runtime that manages lifecycle of containers. Under that lies runC. That's the process that actually allocates C groups, environments, resources, that sort of low-level container stuff. So we have kubelet sitting on top of Docker, sitting on top of containerd, sitting on top of runC, sitting on top of the actual operating system with C groups and stuff. Oh yeah, and there can be any amount of shim processes anywhere in between. Yeah, I get why some of even more experienced engineers got confused. I mean, if you started using Docker 5 years ago, it was not like this at all. Yeah, I'll link a bit of literature to check out underneath if you want more details and motivations and how and why things are actually. So if you look closely, you'll see that a piece of this chain is redundant, because its only job is to translate API requests to an underlying service. It so happens that the name to it is Docker. And that's where people freaked out. You see, kubelet doesn't have to talk to Docker, it can talk directly to containerd or other OCI compliant runtime like CRI-O. Moreover, the containerd itself became mature enough so it can be used safely and efficiently without Docker. Yeah, and still, containerd is the part of that old monolith. Frankly speaking, vast majority of users will swap to containerd without any issues, since they already are using it. Ultimately, this is a good thing, because containerd is compliant to OCI, and Docker is not. But all those precious Docker images and Docker registries are still very relevant, and Docker is still very relevant. Firstly, because you do not want to start a Kubernetes cluster on a single host, and then how else would you build Docker images? At the time of this recording, Kubernetes promises to extend deprecation until at least version 1.22. And even then, nothing's going to change dramatically. You might be worried if you build Docker images inside Kubernetes, like I do. But then there's nothing stopping you from running dockerd in a container. So previously you would forward Docker socket to a container, and now you'll have to map containerd instead of that. That's simple. Again, if only people were reading stuff carefully, it would be clear, abundantly clear for everyone that Docker isn't going anywhere anytime soon. It'll just produce a log entry like a warning at startup in the kubelet that no one ever reads. So why all the public commotion? Well, usually, changelogs and documentation for complex stuff like Kubernetes is written by techies and for techies. So that requires reader to have a certain amount of knowledge and or inquisitiveness. But these days, messing with clouds is easier than it ever was, and yeah, it inevitably leads to people with less knowledge, less experience, and or less will to figure stuff out, to read those documents and form strong opinions. Now, is it a problem? I have no clue. But it does require some adjustments to a process. So either we will force developers to document stuff on the level of explain me like I'm 5, or make public to read documentation carefully and actually studying the subject. Guess which one is more plausible? And as a last point, I would like to thank our one and only Kelsey Hightower on behalf of everyone who actually read stuff up, figured out what's happening, and had to endure endless discussions with outraged people who were yelling like, "Ooh, Docker killed! Boo! Kubernetes won!" Thank you, Kelsey. Your Twitter was a savior. Okay, my name's Leo and I'm out. Bye. Jesus, as if Kubernetes could deprecate Docker. It's like saying horses deprecated legs.